The royal guard stood tall and unwavering at his post outside the royal palace. His uniform was perfectly pressed, every detail meticulously in place. The brass buttons on his jacket gleamed under the early morning sun, and his boots shined so brightly they seemed to reflect the world around him. His posture was straight, his eyes fixed forward, and he didn't move an inch. To anyone passing by, he appeared as though he was nothing more than a statue, made of stone and without a hint of emotion. His duty was to stand guard, to protect, and to serve. Nothing else mattered. As part of the royal guard, his job was one of the highest honors in the military. Few were selected for this role, and even fewer lasted through the intense training. It wasn't just about standing still for long hours or wearing the uniform with pride. It was about embodying a sense of discipline and dedication that few could understand. The royal guard didn't just serve the royal family. They represented the very heart of the country's history and values. They were symbols of strength and loyalty. They didn't show weakness. They didn't allow themselves to break down or show emotion. To do so would be a dishonor to the uniform they wore and the centuries of tradition that came with it. For the guard, this job was not just a duty. It was a way of life. He had been trained to push aside any personal feelings and to never let anything distract him from his task. Every time he stood at his post, whether it was in the biting cold of winter or the blistering heat of summer, he stood without complaint. He had long since stopped thinking about how exhausting or isolating it was. His entire being was focused on one thing: the job. Back home, his family and friends often told him they were proud of him. They admired the honor that came with being chosen for the royal guard. But deep inside, he sometimes wondered if they truly understood the sacrifices he had made. The long hours, the missed family gatherings, the feeling of being isolated from the world outside the gates of the palace. They couldn't possibly understand what it felt like to stand guard, to watch the world go by while feeling detached from everything, to live in a bubble where you couldn't show emotion or even speak freely. The guard had always been a disciplined person. Growing up, he had learned the importance of control, of maintaining an emotional distance from everything around him. His parents, both strict and loving, had taught him to be strong, to handle challenges head-on without letting anything get in the way of his responsibilities. It was a lesson that had stuck with him through his childhood and into his adult life. When he joined the military and eventually earned his place in the Royal Guard, he felt like all his years of training and sacrifice had led to this one moment. This was his purpose. This was where he belonged. But over time, even the strongest of walls began to show cracks. Despite his ironclad exterior, there were moments when the guard found himself feeling something he had worked so hard to bury. The longer he served in the Royal Guard, the more he realized that he wasn't just guarding the palace. He was guarding something deeper within himself. There were moments, especially during the quiet times when the palace was still and the visitors few, when the loneliness crept in. It wasn't that he regretted his choice, he loved the honor of the role. But in those rare, quiet moments, he sometimes wondered if there was more to life than standing still, detached from everything and everyone. Still, he never let those thoughts distract him from his duties. He never let anyone see the cracks in his armor. His peers, other members of the Royal Guard, were the same. They never spoke about their personal lives, their struggles, or their feelings. It was all about the uniform, the discipline, and the job. In the world of the Royal Guard, emotions were seen as something to be controlled, something to be kept behind a tightly closed door. They were taught to be machines, operating without flaw or hesitation. But even machines, no matter how perfectly they are made, can wear down over time. The guard didn't know it yet, but the emotional barrier he had so carefully built was about to be tested in a way he never expected. His world, built on the foundation of unyielding duty and silence, was about to shift in a single moment that would change everything he had ever believed about himself. It all began one cold winter morning, when he was stationed near the entrance of the palace. The air was crisp and a light dusting of snow had covered the ground. The palace gates were open, and visitors were starting to arrive for a special event. The guard's eyes scanned the crowd, ever watchful, ensuring that nothing out of the ordinary would happen. His thoughts were still sharp, his focus absolute. He didn't allow his mind to wander, keeping everything locked away behind the barrier he had worked so hard to build. And then, among the crowd, he noticed an elderly man. The man moved slowly, leaning on a cane with each step. He was dressed simply, not like the other visitors who wore formal clothing for the event. The elderly man's face was weathered, his eyes tired yet determined. The guard's attention shifted to him almost instinctively. He couldn't explain why, but there was something about the man that seemed different, something that made the guard feel a pull. The man's presence seemed to carry with it a weight, like he had lived through something far greater than anyone else around him. As the elderly man approached the guard's post, he paused. He didn't say anything at first, but the guard felt his eyes linger on him. There was an unspoken recognition between them, though neither of them spoke a word. The guard felt an unfamiliar stir of emotion inside him. He quickly pushed it aside, focusing on his duty. But for a brief moment he saw something in the elderly man's eyes, a quiet sadness, mixed with strength. Before the guard could even process what he had seen, the elderly man slowly spoke, his voice soft but clear. "You're one of them, aren't you?" he said, nodding towards the royal palace. "The ones who stand guard." The guard gave a stiff nod in response, his voice polite but distant. "Yes, sir, I am." The elderly man smiled faintly, his face creased with years of experience. "I used to be like you," he said. "Back in my day, I stood guard too." The words hit the guard like a wave, though he couldn't explain why. There was something about the way the man spoke, something in his tone that spoke of a life the guard could only imagine. He looked at the man, his face stoic, but his mind began to race. The elderly man had been a guard once? The thought lingered in the guard's mind as the man continued to speak, recounting stories of his own time in service, of battles fought, of comrades lost. The guard listened, still trying to maintain his composure, but something about the conversation began to shake his unshakable exterior. The emotions he had hidden for so long were beginning to stir, though he couldn't yet understand what was happening. The elderly man's words were simple, but they carried a weight that the guard couldn't ignore. In that moment, something shifted. He didn't know it yet, but this brief encounter with a stranger who had lived a life so different from his own was about to change him in ways he never imagined. The elderly man had been standing in front of the royal guard for several moments, his eyes steady, his face worn with age and wisdom. The guard continued to stand at attention, unsure of what to do. He had never expected a conversation to start with someone like this. The man's frailty was evident. His steps were slow and his shoulders were hunched, but despite his age, there was something commanding about him, something that made the guard feel as though he were in the presence of someone who had lived a lifetime of stories that would never be told to the outside world. The guard had been trained to stand unmoving, to never engage in unnecessary conversation. His role was to be a silent protector of the royal family and the palace grounds. He knew that emotions, stories, and conversations were distractions from the task at hand. He had been taught to block them out, to focus solely on his duty. But this man in front of him was different. There was something about him that the guard couldn't quite place. "Where are you from?" the elderly man asked softly, breaking the silence between them. His voice was gentle but filled with experience, as though he had spent years speaking to soldiers, trying to connect with them. The guard hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. "I'm from here," he replied, his voice neutral, almost mechanical. The elderly man nodded slowly. "Here in the palace?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly as if he were trying to make sense of the guard's response. The guard nodded again. "Yes, sir. I've been serving the royal family for several years now." The man's eyes flickered with recognition. He studied the guard for a moment as though he were weighing him, trying to understand who this young man was. What kind of person would dedicate their life to standing still, day after day, in service to the crown? The man had seen many young soldiers in his time, but there was something about this one that made him want to ask more questions. "You know," the man said slowly, his voice softer now, "I once stood where you're standing. Not here, of course," he added with a light chuckle, "but I've been in the military. Back in my day, I was just like you. A soldier, a guard. We did our duty with pride. We didn't question it. We just did it. It was what we were trained to do." The guard stood still, his expression unchanged, but inside, a flicker of curiosity sparked. How could this old man, frail and slow, have been like him? It seemed impossible. He had a hard time imagining the man as a soldier, much less a guard. The old man could barely walk without his cane. How could he have been strong enough to stand at attention, to protect, to serve? "I see you don't believe me," the elderly man continued, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. I suppose I don't look much like a soldier anymore. Age has a way of wearing down the body. He paused, then added quietly, but not the mind. The mind doesn't forget the things it's been through. The guard didn't know what to say. It was strange. This man seemed so removed from the soldier he must have once been. Yet his words carried a depth that the guard couldn't ignore. He stood there in silence, unsure of how to respond. The old man smiled as though he understood the guard's thoughts. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "You're thinking that I couldn't possibly have been one of you. But the truth is, I've walked the same path. I've faced the same struggles. The only difference is that time has caught up with me. Time catches up with everyone. But the stories, the experiences, they stay with you. They shape you even when your body no longer can." The guard's mind began to race. He had always viewed himself as separate from those who came before him, the older soldiers who had already given everything in their time. His training had taught him to focus only on the present, to live in the moment and perform his duties without thinking of the past. But here, in this quiet corner of the palace, surrounded by the stillness of winter, he was forced to confront something he had never considered: the weight of time. The thought that one day he too might grow old and be forgotten, just like this man standing in front of him, seemed both terrifying and humbling. For a moment there was a silence between them, the kind of silence that is filled with 1,000 unspoken thoughts. The guard could feel the tension in the air, the strange connection that seemed to form without either of them doing anything to create it. It was as if the elderly man's words had peeled away something deep inside the guard, exposing the vulnerability he had buried for so long. The elderly man shifted his weight, leaning more heavily on his cane. "I'll tell you something," he said, his voice growing softer, more intimate. "When I was your age, I thought I knew everything. I thought I was invincible. I thought the job would always be the same, that nothing would ever change. But that's not how life works, my friend. Life changes. People change. And sometimes you have to change too." The guard felt a lump form in his throat. He had never allowed himself to think about change, not in his life and certainly not in his job. He had always viewed his role as a guard as something permanent, something that would always remain the same. His identity was tied to his uniform, to the discipline and the structure of his duty. But now, standing in front of this man who had clearly lived a lifetime of experiences, he realized that everything he had ever known could change in an instant. The elderly man's voice grew quiet again, as if he were reflecting on his own past. "I remember the first time I stood guard. It was in a place far from here, in a land I didn't know, surrounded by people I couldn't understand. I was scared, unsure of myself. But I did it. And over time I grew stronger. I grew into my role. And eventually I realized that being a soldier wasn't just about standing still. It was about carrying the weight of those who couldn't stand. It was about holding on to something bigger than yourself." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a question the guard wasn't sure how to answer. What did it mean to be a soldier? What did it mean to stand guard? He had always thought it was just about duty, but now in this conversation, he was beginning to understand that there was more to it. There had to be more. The elderly man turned his gaze back to the guard, his eyes soft with understanding. "You'll understand one day," he said quietly. "You'll understand that the duty you carry is a heavy one, but it's also one that shapes you. It shapes your heart. It shapes your soul. And one day when you look back, you'll see that the hardest part wasn't standing still at your post. The hardest part was learning how to carry everything that comes with it." The guard stood there, feeling the weight of the man's words settling on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what to say, what to feel. But he knew deep down that something had changed in him. This conversation, brief as it had been, had opened a door he didn't know existed. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was beginning to understand what it really meant to serve, to stand guard, not just with his body, but with his heart. The quiet winter air wrapped around the palace like a cold blanket. Snow had started to fall again, light and fluffy, covering the ground in a delicate layer of white. The elderly man, still leaning on his cane, looked out over the courtyard, watching the flakes fall gently from the sky. The royal guard stood beside him, his mind swirling with thoughts he hadn't known he was capable of thinking. He had been trained to keep his emotions tightly locked away, but something about this elderly man had unlocked a door he wasn't sure how to close again. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, almost peaceful. It was as if the world outside the palace had slowed down, allowing them both time to reflect. The guard continued to stand at attention, his body still in perfect form, but his mind wasn't focused on the duty at hand. His thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation he had just had. The elderly man's words echoed in his mind. One day when you look back, you'll see that the hardest part wasn't standing still at your post. The hardest part was learning how to carry everything that comes with it. The guard had never thought about his role in this way before. He had always believed that being a soldier, being a guard, was simply about standing firm, following orders and maintaining an unbreakable composure. He had never considered that there was more to it, that there were unseen burdens that came with the uniform, invisible weight that one carried with them every day. The elderly man, sensing the young guard's quiet struggle, finally broke the silence. He turned his head to face the guard, his eyes kind but knowing. "You don't have to keep it all inside, you know," he said softly. The words hit the guard like a jolt, and for a brief moment he forgot to control his expression. His face twitched slightly, and for the first time in a long while he felt something stir deep inside him, a feeling he wasn't ready to face. His chest tightened as if the weight of all those years of duty, of silence, of keeping everything in check was suddenly too much to bear. He quickly pushed the feeling down, but it lingered just beneath the surface. I don't know what you mean," the guard replied, trying to maintain his stoic mask. The elderly man didn't rush to answer. He simply nodded slowly as if he understood. "I can see it in your eyes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know the weight you're carrying, young man. It's the same weight I carried when I was your age. It's the weight of duty, yes, but it's also the weight of the things you've seen, the things you've felt, and the things you've had to bury in order to keep standing tall. You don't have to keep it all buried forever. You don't have to be perfect." The guard looked away, his gaze shifting to the ground as the snow continued to fall around them. He clenched his fists at his sides, not because he was angry, but because he was trying to hold on to something, anything that would keep him grounded. He had spent years perfecting his ability to remain unmoved, to push away anything that threatened to break his composed exterior. But the more he stood there, listening to the elderly man's words, the harder it became to ignore the growing storm inside him. The elderly man took a slow step closer, sensing the guard's inner turmoil. "You're not alone," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I know it feels like you are sometimes. You stand out there in the cold and the silence, and you think no one understands. But believe me, we all have our battles. We all have our burdens. The strongest ones, those who stand tall when it feels impossible, are the ones who learn to carry those burdens not just for themselves, but for others too." The guard's breath caught in his throat. There was something in the man's voice, something in the way he spoke, that made the guard feel understood. For the first time, he felt like someone saw past his uniform, past the armor he wore to hide his true self. The elderly man wasn't asking him to be perfect. He wasn't judging him. He was simply offering a chance for the guard to release some of the weight he had been carrying for so long. The guard swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked up at the elderly man, his chest tightening again, but this time it wasn't from fear of breaking down. It was something else, something deeper, a sense of realization perhaps, or even a longing for something he hadn't allowed himself to want: connection. The elderly man's eyes softened as he saw the guard's struggle. He didn't say anything more at first. Instead, he simply placed a hand on the guard's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. For a moment, the guard didn't know what to do. He stood still, frozen, unsure of whether he should pull away or let himself be vulnerable for once. Finally, the elderly man spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "I lost so many good men in my time," he said, his voice shaking ever so slightly. "Brothers, comrades. We fought side by side, and then one by one they were gone. The hardest part wasn't losing them. The hardest part was not being able to show the world how much they meant to me, how much we meant to each other. The world doesn't always let us grieve in the way we need to. We're told to stand tall, to keep our heads high, and to keep moving forward. But sometimes moving forward means letting go of what you've been holding on to." The guard's breath caught again, but this time he couldn't push the emotions away. The man's words struck a chord deep inside him. He thought about his own comrades, his fellow guards, those who stood beside him every day, their faces just as stoic as his. They were all like machines, built to be strong, to be unshakable, But no one ever spoke of the pain, the fear, the loneliness that sometimes came with the job. No one ever shared what it felt like to lose someone, to watch them leave and never come back. Sometimes, the elderly man continued, his voice growing softer, you need to let go. You need to cry. It's okay. You don't have to carry it all alone. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The guard felt something crack inside him, something that had been locked away for so long. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't failure. It was just human. And for the first time, the guard realized that it was okay to feel. It was okay to let go of the mask and let someone in. A single tear slipped down the guard's cheek. He wiped it quickly as though embarrassed, but the elderly man only nodded gently. It's all right, he said softly. You don't have to hide anymore. The guard's chest tightened as the emotions he had kept locked away for so long began to flood him. The tears came faster now, and he didn't try to stop them. He let them fall one after another. His shoulders shook, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had been holding back. The loneliness, the pain, the fear of losing himself in the uniform, the fear of never being enough. The elderly man stood beside him, silent but present, offering the kind of comfort that words could never express. In that moment, the guard realized that the greatest strength wasn't in standing still, unmoved. It was in allowing yourself to feel, to grieve, and to heal.